There are few names in the history of crime that evoke such a strong sense of mystery, fear, and fascination as Jack the Ripper. Over a century has passed since his gruesome crimes terrorized the fog-laden streets of London, yet his identity remains unknown, his motives a topic of endless debate, and his legacy firmly cemented in the annals of history. Jack the Ripper is not merely a criminal, he has become a legend, an enduring enigma that continues to captivate the minds of historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. He is the specter that haunts the dark alleyways of Victorian London, the faceless figure whose name has become synonymous with the very notion of an unsolvable crime. Between August and November of 1888, a series of brutal murders took place in the East End district of Whitechapel, a crime-ridden and poverty-stricken area of London. The victims, all women, were found in horrific conditions, throats slashed, bodies mutilated, and in some cases, organs removed with chilling precision. The sheer savagery of the attack sent shockwaves through London's working-class communities, where fear and paranoia quickly took hold. As the murders continued and the police failed to apprehend the killer, the name Jack the Ripper emerged, a name that would forever be associated with terror and mystery. The case of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved crimes in history for several reasons. First and foremost, the investigation was plagued with difficulties from the very start. In the late 19th century, forensic science was still in its infancy, fingerprinting had yet to be introduced, crime scene preservation was practically non-existent, and the idea of criminal profiling was little more than speculation. Eyewitness accounts were unreliable, and the lack of modern investigative techniques made it nearly impossible to identify the murderer conclusively. The police force, overwhelmed by public pressure and media scrutiny, struggled to make progress in an investigation that seemed doomed to fail. Yet, the failure to capture Jack the Ripper is only part of what makes this case so enduring. The second reason for its continued relevance lies in the vast number of theories surrounding the identity of the killer. Over the decades, countless suspects have been proposed, ranging from disturbed locals to prominent figures within British society. Some believe the Ripper was a failed doctor with a penchant for violence, while others argue he was a member of the British aristocracy, shielded by wealth and influence. Theories have emerged suggesting he was an artist, a butcher, a sailor, or even an individual suffering from severe psychological disorders. Despite the extensive speculation, no definitive proof has ever surfaced to confirm any one suspect's guilt. Perhaps even more crucial in cementing the legend of Jack the Ripper was the role of the media. The late 19th century was a time of rapid expansion for the British press, and newspapers seized upon the Ripper case as the ultimate story, one filled with horror, intrigue, and speculation. Sensationalized headlines, dramatic illustrations, and fabricated details fueled public hysteria, ensuring that Jack the Ripper became not just a criminal but a larger-than-life figure. The infamous letters attributed to the killer, such as the "Dear Boss" letter and the "Gruesome" from Hell letter, only added to the frenzy, whether or not they were genuine communications from the murderer. The impact of the Jack the Ripper case extends far beyond the Whitechapel murders themselves. The fear that gripped London in the autumn of 1888 exposed the harsh realities of life in Victorian society, particularly the conditions faced by the poor and the vulnerable. The murders forced the public to confront issues such as prostitution, homelessness, and the failings of law enforcement. In many ways, the Ripper case became a catalyst for change, influencing developments in forensic science, criminology, and investigative techniques. Perhaps even more crucial in cementing the legend of Jack the Ripper was the role of the media. The late 19th century was a time of rapid expansion for the British press, and newspapers seized upon the Ripper case as the ultimate story, one filled with horror, intrigue, and speculation. Sensationalized headlines, dramatic illustrations, and fabricated details fueled public hysteria, ensuring that Jack the Ripper became not just a criminal but a larger-than-life figure. The infamous letters attributed to the killer, such as the "Dear Boss" letter and the "Gruesome" from Hell letter, only added to the frenzy, whether or not they were genuine communications from the murderer. The impact of the Jack the Ripper case extends far beyond the Whitechapel murders themselves. The fear that gripped London in the autumn of 1888 exposed the harsh realities of life in Victorian society, particularly the conditions faced by the poor and the vulnerable. The murders forced the public to confront issues such as prostitution, homelessness, and the failings of law enforcement. In many ways, the Ripper case became a catalyst for change, influencing developments in forensic science, criminology, and investigative techniques. Perhaps even more crucial in cementing the legend of Jack the Ripper was the role of the media. The late 19th century was a time of rapid expansion for the British press, and newspapers seized upon the Ripper case as the ultimate story, one filled with horror, intrigue, and speculation. Sensationalized headlines, dramatic illustrations, and fabricated details fueled public hysteria, ensuring that Jack the Ripper became not just a criminal but a larger-than-life figure. The infamous letters attributed to the killer, such as the "Dear Boss" letter and the "Gruesome" from Hell letter, only added to the frenzy, whether or not they were genuine communications from the murderer. At the heart of this exploration lies the ultimate question: who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a lone predator, a methodical serial killer hiding in plain sight, or was he part of something even more sinister? Why was he never caught, despite the enormous efforts to apprehend him? And perhaps most importantly, will we ever truly uncover his identity, or is Jack the Ripper destined to remain an unsolvable mystery, forever lurking in the shadows of history? Join us as we step back in time, walking the gaslit streets of Whitechapel, where fear ruled the night and where the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. This is the story of one of the most infamous criminals in history, a tale of horror, speculation, and mystery that continues to haunt us to this day. Historical context: London in the 19th century. To understand the chilling legend of Jack the Ripper, we must first step back in time and immerse ourselves in the world of 19th century London. It was a city of contrasts, one of grandeur and squalor, of wealth and abject poverty. Nowhere were these contrasts more evident than in the East End, particularly the district of Whitechapel, which became the backdrop for one of the most infamous crime sprees in history. Victorian London, a city of extremes. By the late 19th century, London had established itself as the capital of the British Empire, a metropolis bustling with over 6 million residents. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the city into a global powerhouse of commerce, industry, and innovation. It was a time of remarkable scientific advancements and breathtaking economic growth. Grand buildings, affluent neighborhoods, and luxurious theaters stood as a testament to the city's wealth. However, beneath this glittering facade lay a different reality, one of unimaginable suffering, particularly in the East End. While the rich indulged in opulence, many Londoners lived in abject poverty. The city was overcrowded, with slums and tenement housing teeming with desperate individuals seeking work, shelter, and sustenance. Disease was rampant, clean drinking water was scarce, and sanitation was virtually non-existent in many areas. The rapid industrialization that had made London a financial capital also fueled mass migration, bringing in waves of workers from across Britain and beyond, further straining resources and deepening the divide between rich and poor. This extreme social inequality created a breeding ground for crime, violence, and vice. In the dark alleys of London's poorest districts, the law was often meaningless, and survival depended on sheer resilience. Gangs ruled certain territories, and street crime was an everyday reality. For those at the bottom of society, options were limited. Many turned to crime, alcoholism, or, in the case of thousands of women, prostitution, which flourished in areas like Whitechapel. Whitechapel, the heart of darkness. If Victorian London was a city of extremes, then Whitechapel was its darkest corner. Located in the East End, this district was a place of despair, a warren of narrow streets, dimly lit alleyways, and overcrowded lodging houses. The area was home to some of the most impoverished people in Britain: laborers, immigrants, the homeless, and, most notably, sex workers. At the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, Whitechapel was notorious for its high crime rate. Robberies, assaults, and murders were commonplace, yet few cases captured the public's attention. The police were overwhelmed, underfunded, and often ineffective in dealing with the lawlessness. Corruption was rife, and the force struggled to maintain order in a place where desperation often led people to commit acts of brutality. One of the most infamous aspects of Whitechapel was the prevalence of common lodging houses, cheap, overcrowded accommodations where people could pay a few pennies for a night's shelter. These were often filled with drunks, criminals, and those who had nowhere else to go. The women who would later become Jack the Ripper's victims were all too familiar with these places, often moving between lodging houses, sleeping in the streets when they couldn't afford a bed, and resorting to prostitution to survive. The streets themselves were a labyrinth of dangers. Poor lighting, thick fog, and the lack of organized policing made Whitechapel a haven for crime. It was in these very alleys and courtyards that Jack the Ripper would later strike, preying on some of the city's most vulnerable women. Prostitution, unemployment, and disease. For many women in Whitechapel, prostitution was not a choice but a necessity. Economic hardship left few alternatives, and with unemployment rates soaring, many had no means of making a living other than selling their bodies on the streets. These women were among the most vulnerable members of society, facing violence, disease, and social stigma daily. The police estimated that thousands of women engaged in prostitution in the East End, though the exact numbers are difficult to determine. Many were not full-time prostitutes but worked sporadically, turning to sex work when they couldn't find other means of survival. Their clients were often working-class men, sailors, and laborers, some of whom were just as desperate and dangerous as the streets themselves. Living conditions in Whitechapel made matters worse. Diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, and syphilis spread rapidly, often leading to premature death. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and life expectancy was dismally low, especially for the poor. Hunger and malnutrition weakened people, making them more susceptible to illness. The squalid environment of the East End, combined with widespread destitution, created a population that lived in perpetual struggle, where hope was a rare commodity. Alcoholism was another major issue. Gin palaces and cheap taverns were everywhere, offering the poor an escape, however temporary, from their miserable existence. Many of Jack the Ripper's victims were known to be heavy drinkers, frequenting local pubs in search of clients or simply to numb the pain of their daily reality. The combination of alcohol, crime, and economic desperation made Whitechapel a highly dangerous place, where violence could erupt at any moment. Law enforcement and the limitations of 19th-century forensics. The policing of Whitechapel was woefully inadequate. The Metropolitan Police, responsible for maintaining law and order, were under immense strain, trying to combat crime in one of the most dangerous parts of London with limited resources. Officers patrolled the streets on foot, armed with little more than a whistle and a wooden truncheon. There were no radios, no forensic science, and no databases of known criminals. When a crime was committed, investigations relied heavily on witness testimonies and basic detective work. The forensic science of the time was in its infancy. Fingerprinting had not yet been introduced, and DNA analysis was over a century away. Blood analysis was rudimentary, and the idea of criminal profiling was virtually non-existent. Autopsies could reveal cause of death, but they provided little information about the perpetrator. As a result, police investigations often led to dead ends. The police faced another major challenge: public mistrust. Many working-class citizens, particularly in areas like Whitechapel, viewed the authorities with suspicion. Corruption within the force had created widespread resentment, and many people saw the police as oppressors rather than protectors. As a result, witnesses were often reluctant to come forward, and cooperation with investigations was limited. By the time Jack the Ripper began his killing spree in 1888, the Metropolitan Police were already struggling to maintain control over Whitechapel. The sudden emergence of a brutal and methodical killer only highlighted their weaknesses, leading to widespread criticism of their efforts to catch him. The inability to apprehend Jack the Ripper exposed the flaws in 19th-century law enforcement and would ultimately become one of the key reasons why the case remains unsolved to this day. The Whitechapel murders did not occur in isolation. They were the product of a society deeply divided by class, wealth, and opportunity. Victorian London was a city where the rich lived in splendor while the poor struggled to survive in conditions of extreme deprivation. Whitechapel, in particular, was a place of desperation, violence, and lawlessness, where crime thrived, and human life was often regarded as cheap. Understanding this context is crucial in examining the case of Jack the Ripper. His victims were not just random women, they were products of a brutal system that offered them few choices. The East End provided the perfect hunting ground for a predator who knew that his victims' deaths would not be missed by those in power. It is within this setting that the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. A shadowy figure, striking in the darkness, preying upon the vulnerable, and disappearing without a trace. A murderer whose crimes would not only haunt the people of Whitechapel but would also become one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. The first murders and the rise of the legend. As the summer of 1888 gave way to autumn, the darkened streets of Whitechapel became the hunting ground for a killer whose name would echo through history. Jack the Ripper, as he would later be called, began his brutal spree with a series of murders that stunned the city of London and terrified its most vulnerable citizens. Though violent crime was common in the East End, the nature of these killings was different, more vicious, more deliberate, and carrying an unsettling level of precision. The early victims, all women living in extreme poverty, met their ends in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Their bodies, discovered in the cold, narrow alleyways of Whitechapel, bore the marks of a killer who was not only ruthless but also methodical. With each murder, the fear in Whitechapel grew, and as the press began to report on the killings, the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. The first victims, women on the margins of society. Before diving into the chilling details of the first murders, it is essential to understand who these women were. They were not high-profile figures, they were not wealthy or powerful. Instead, they were among the many poor, destitute women who struggled to survive in London's unforgiving East End. Each of these women had lived difficult lives, marked by hardship, illness, and the desperate need to earn enough money to afford a place to sleep. Many of them had turned to prostitution, not as a profession, but as a means of survival. They were often transient, staying in cheap lodging houses when they could afford them, and sleeping in the streets when they could not. The first known victim of the killer who would become Jack the Ripper was Mary Ann Polly Nichols. Mary Ann Nichols, murdered August 31, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was a 43-year-old woman who had struggled through years of poverty and alcoholism. She had been married and had children, but by 1888, she was estranged from her family and living on the streets of Whitechapel. Like many women in her situation, she frequently stayed in common lodging houses when she could afford the small nightly fee. On the night of August 30, 1888, Polly was seen leaving a lodging house after failing to pay for her bed. She reportedly told a friend, "I'll soon get my DOS money," implying that she planned to earn it through prostitution. A few hours later, at approximately 3:40 a.m., her lifeless body was discovered on Bucks Row. Her throat had been slashed twice, nearly severing her head from her body. Her abdomen had been cut open with deep, precise incisions. The brutality of the attack shocked the local police, but at this stage, they had no idea that this was just the beginning. Annie Chapman, murdered September 8, 1888. The second confirmed victim, Annie Chapman, was found dead just over a week after Polly Nichols' murder. Like Polly, Annie was living a hard life, struggling with alcoholism and scraping together enough money for lodging. Her body was found at 6 a.m. on September 8, in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was even more gruesome than the first murder. Annie's throat had been cut, but the real horror lay in the mutilation of her body. Her abdomen had been sliced open, and some of her internal organs were missing. The nature of these injuries led investigators to a chilling conclusion: the killer was not only sadistic but possibly possessed a knowledge of human anatomy. This detail would later fuel speculation that Jack the Ripper had medical training. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, The Double Event, September 30, 1888. By the end of September, fear was spreading rapidly in Whitechapel, but nothing could prepare the residents for what became known as the Double Event. In the early hours of September 30th, two more women were murdered within the span of an hour, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Elizabeth Stride was found first. Her body was discovered at 12:45 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. Unlike the previous victims, her body showed no signs of abdominal mutilation. Only her throat had been cut. Some investigators speculated that the killer had been interrupted before he could carry out further mutilations. Less than an hour later, at 1:45 a.m., the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. This murder was far more consistent with the earlier killings. Her throat was slashed, her abdomen was ripped open, and her body had been severely mutilated. Most disturbingly, parts of her kidney and uterus had been removed. This confirmed what police already feared: they were dealing with a singular, remorseless killer who was escalating in both brutality and confidence. Mary Jane Kelly, murdered November 9, 1888. The final and most horrific murder was that of Mary Jane Kelly. Unlike the previous victims, Mary Jane was significantly younger, believed to be in her mid-20s. She lived in a small rented room rather than on the streets, but like the others, she had fallen into prostitution due to economic hardship. Her mutilated body was found in her own room at 13 Miller's Court on the morning of November 9th. The scene was unlike anything the police had encountered before. Mary Jane's body had been eviscerated beyond recognition. Her face was destroyed, her throat had been slashed down to the spine, and her internal organs had been scattered around the room. The killer had taken his time. With this murder, the killings came to a sudden and mysterious halt. But by this point, Jack the Ripper had already become a legend. The killer's methods, precision, brutality, and escalation. One of the most terrifying aspects of the Ripper murders was the sheer brutality involved. Unlike typical street killings, these murders were not simply acts of desperation or anger. They were calculated. The killers seemed to strike with surgical precision, removing organs and inflicting deep, controlled incisions. The escalation in violence was also striking. The early murders were brutal but restrained compared to the later victims, suggesting that the killer was growing bolder with each attack. This pattern would later be analyzed by criminologists, who noted that many serial killers escalate their crimes as they refine their methods and feed their violent urges. Public reaction and the growing fear in Whitechapel. As word spread of the killings, fear gripped the East End. Women, especially sex workers, became terrified to walk the streets at night. The police presence increased, but the murderer continued to evade capture. The public's frustration grew, and the inability of law enforcement to stop the killer led to widespread outrage. Rumors swirled about the identity of the killer. Was he a madman? A butcher? A doctor? Some believed he was a foreigner, while others thought he might be a member of high society hiding in plain sight. The role of newspapers in shaping the legend. Jack the Ripper was one of the first serial killers to be widely publicized in the press. Newspapers played a crucial role in sensationalizing the case, printing lurid details, gruesome illustrations, and speculative theories. The public became obsessed, and the press capitalized on their fear. It was during this period that the name, Jack the Ripper, first appeared. It came from a letter sent to the police, allegedly written by the killer himself. Though many believe it was a hoax, the name stuck, and a legend was born. The first murders of Jack the Ripper shocked Whitechapel and plunged the district into an atmosphere of terror. Each killing seemed more gruesome than the last, and as the newspapers spread the story, the name of Jack the Ripper became infamous. But who was he? And why did he suddenly stop? These questions remain unanswered, ensuring that the legend of Jack the Ripper continues to captivate and horrify us over a century later. The Autumn of Terror, the Canonical Five. The autumn of 1888 in London is forever tied to a series of grisly murders that shocked the world. This period, often referred to as the Autumn of Terror, marked the peak of the Jack the Ripper killings. 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were brutally murdered in the Whitechapel area of London within a span of just a few weeks. These 5 victims are known as the Canonical Five, and their deaths are what cemented Jack the Ripper's place in history as one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. The Canonical Five, victims of a madman. The first of the 5, Mary Ann Nichols, was discovered in the early hours of August 31, 1888, in Bucks Row, a narrow, dimly lit street in Whitechapel. She had been slashed viciously, with her throat slashed so deeply that it almost severed her head. The violence was striking, yet there was no immediate sign of sexual assault. This would be a hallmark of the murders to come, where the killer's primary focus seemed to be on the mutilation of his victims rather than on any form of sexual gratification. Annie Chapman followed on September 8. Her body was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street, just a short walk from the location of Nichols' murder. Like Nichols, Annie had been viciously attacked, her throat slit, and her abdomen cut open. In an even more disturbing twist, her uterus had been removed, leading investigators to believe that the murderer had some knowledge of anatomy. This marked an escalation in the brutality of the killings, signaling that the killer's violence was increasing in intensity. The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was murdered on the night of September 30th, the same night as the double murder of Catherine Eddowes. Stride's body was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat slit but with no further mutilation, a fact that set her apart from the others. Some investigators later speculated that the killer had been interrupted during his attack on Stride, preventing him from performing the usual mutilations. Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, a short distance from Stride's location. Her throat was also slit, and like the other victims, her body had been mutilated. Her left kidney was missing, and her face was disfigured, evidence that the killer's method of murder was becoming more increasingly gruesome and more calculated. Finally, Mary Jane Kelly's murder, which took place on November 9, brought an end to the spree of killings attributed to Jack the Ripper. Kelly's murder was by far the most horrific. Found in her room at Miller's Court, her body had been so savagely mutilated that it was almost unrecognizable. Her heart was removed from her body, and her organs were scattered about the room, suggesting that the murderer had spent an extended period with the victim, not in a rush to flee the scene. This was the final known murder of the Ripper and was also the most chilling, giving rise to further speculation about the killer's psychological state. Patterns in the killings and increasing horror. As the killings progressed, several disturbing patterns emerged. First, there was the brutal nature of the murders. Each victim had her throat slit, followed by some form of abdominal mutilation, often involving the removal of internal organs. The precision with which the mutilations were performed suggested that the killer may have had some anatomical knowledge or at least a degree of skill in dissection. The location of the murders also followed a pattern. All the victims were murdered in the Whitechapel area, one of the poorest and most crime-ridden parts of London. The murders were concentrated within a small radius, primarily in dark, isolated areas where the killer could remain undetected. The proximity of the crimes in both time and space led to growing panic among local residents and an increasing sense of fear across London. Moreover, the timing of the murders seemed deliberate. Many of the victims were prostitutes or women who were vulnerable due to their social and economic circumstances. This further deepened the belief that Jack the Ripper targeted individuals who were on the margins of society, people whose disappearances were less likely to attract immediate attention from the authorities. The brutality of these murders led to public hysteria. Each new death seemed to confirm the worst fears of the citizens of Whitechapel, that a vicious, remorseless killer was on the loose, preying on the most vulnerable women in the area. At the same time, the press began to sensationalize the killings, fueling fear and drawing attention to the murders. Public outcry and the media's role in spreading fear created an atmosphere of terror in the streets of London, making it almost impossible for the police to solve the case. Psychological profile of the murderer. The brutal nature of these murders prompted psychologists and criminologists, both then and now, to develop various theories about the psychology of the murderer. One prevailing idea was that Jack the Ripper suffered from a deep psychological disorder, possibly psychopathy or sociopathy, which enabled him to commit such horrific acts without remorse or apparent emotion. Many theories suggest that the Ripper was highly organized, taking the time to plan his attacks in dark, secluded areas where he would not be disturbed. He may have chosen his victims carefully, selecting those he felt were easy targets, prostitutes who frequented the streets late at night. His killings displayed a methodical approach, but also an escalating sense of violence and mutilation. At the same time, the brutal disfigurements of the victims indicated a deep desire to control and dominate. Removing organs, especially in such a clinical, precise way, points to a killer who was fascinated with the inner workings of the human body and who sought a form of power through his acts. It is possible that the Ripper viewed his victims not as human beings but as objects to be destroyed and remade according to his own twisted vision. While the psychological profile of Jack the Ripper remains speculative, there is little doubt that his killings were driven by a deep-seated need for violence and control. The emotional distance displayed in the mutilation suggests a mind detached from the horrors of what he was doing, capable of horrific acts without remorse. How these murders shaped the Jack the Ripper myth. The deaths of the 5 canonical victims were not just brutal and shocking, they were also pivotal in cementing the Jack the Ripper legend. The press, which had already been reporting on the murders in increasingly sensational terms, began to label the killer as Jack the Ripper, a name that carried with it both an air of mystery and a sense of malevolent power. The killer's unknown identity, coupled with the sheer horror of the crimes, captured the public's imagination and made the case a symbol of unsolved mystery. These 5 murders, with their similarities and escalating brutality, created a mythic figure, a faceless, merciless killer who could strike anywhere, at any time. The media attention, combined with the growing fear of the public, ensured that Jack the Ripper would become more than just a serial killer. He would become a part of the collective cultural consciousness, a figure of terror who would haunt the streets of London and inspire generations of writers, filmmakers, and criminologists. Even though the killer was never apprehended, the 5 canonical victims have come to represent the very essence of the Ripper legend. They were the ones whose deaths cemented the connection between the Ripper and the violence of the late 19th century. Their suffering and the mystery surrounding their deaths became the foundation upon which the Jack the Ripper myth was built, an enduring story of a killer who was never caught, yet whose name will forever be linked with terror and intrigue. The Autumn of Terror was a time of profound fear and societal reflection. The killings highlighted the darkest corners of London and forced people to reckon with the brutal realities of poverty, crime, and social neglect. But more than that, these 5 murders marked the beginning of one of the most enduring mysteries in history, one that continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world even over a century later. The mysterious letters, from hell and other messages. Among the most intriguing aspects of the Jack the Ripper case were the letters that were sent to the police, newspapers, and other public figures, supposedly from the killer himself. These letters, often written in a grotesque and taunting manner, fueled the already pervasive sense of fear and speculation surrounding the murders. They became a key part of the Ripper mythos, adding layers of mystery and increasing public anxiety. The most famous of these letters is the "From Hell" letter, which remains one of the most chilling pieces of correspondence in criminal history. The infamous letters sent to police and the media. After the first murders in August and September 1888, the police and the press began to receive a steady stream of letters purporting to be from Jack the Ripper. These letters varied in content and tone, but they all had one thing in common: they were designed to mock the authorities and generate fear among the public. The earliest of these letters, often referred to as the "Dear Boss" letter, was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888, just days before the brutal murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. In this letter, the writer gleefully confessed to being Jack the Ripper, stating in crude, vulgar language that he was responsible for the killings. The letter was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," a name that would go on to haunt history. The "Dear Boss" letter was notable not only for its content but for its tone. It was written in a mocking, almost playful manner, with the killer expressing amusement at the police's inability to catch him. The letter also contained gruesome details that seemed to confirm the writer's intimate knowledge of the crimes, though it was unclear whether these details were truly accurate or simply intended to mislead the police. The inclusion of a detailed description of the mutilations and the killer's apparent delight in his work gave the letter a sinister edge, further heightening public fear. After the "Dear Boss" letter, a string of similar communications followed, though not all were as detailed or as impactful. Some were merely brief notes or postcards, such as the "Saucy Jackie" postcard, which was sent to the Central News Agency shortly after the "Dear Boss" letter. The message on the postcard was more cryptic, with the writer referring to his own actions and mentioning that he had "got the ladies' throats," indicating that the Ripper was still actively at work. The postcard was signed with the same name, Jack the Ripper, and was consistent in tone with the earlier letter. These letters, and others that followed, were read by the public with a mix of fascination and horror. Newspapers published the letters in full, often accompanying them with sensational headlines that emphasized the killer's apparent enjoyment of his crimes. As a result, the letters became part of the cultural fabric of the time, helping to further mythologize the figure of Jack the Ripper. The "From Hell" letter and its eerie contents. By far the most infamous of the Ripper's letters was the "From Hell" letter, which was received by George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on October 16, 1888. This letter was different from the others in its chilling tone and its disturbing content. It was accompanied by a small box, containing a piece of human kidney that appeared to have been removed from one of the Ripper's victims. The letter itself was written in a disjointed, almost incoherent style. The writer began by addressing Lusk, stating, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, you will be sorry to hear that I have not caught the ruddy bastard who's been making such a nuisance of himself in Whitechapel, and is causing such a fuss." The writer then goes on to describe the removal of the victim's kidney in a graphic manner, claiming that it had been sent to the doctor who was supposed to be treating one of the victims. The writer also mentioned that the kidney had been fried and eaten as part of a dark, twisted culinary act. The "From Hell" letter stands out not just because of its eerie contents, but also due to the presence of the kidney fragment, which seemed to serve as proof that the writer had intimate knowledge of the crime scene. The inclusion of the organ, especially one from a victim's body, created a sense of unease and suggested that the killer was not only interested in murder but also in grotesque acts of mutilation and even cannibalism. This letter, more than any of the others, hinted at the killer's deep psychological disturbance and added a new level of horror to the already grisly murders. The "From Hell" letter, with its accompanying piece of kidney, was widely considered the most authentic letter from the Ripper, partly because of the specificity of the details and the macabre nature of the item enclosed. The piece of kidney appeared to match the one missing from Catherine Eddowes during her murder, leading many to believe that the letter was indeed from the killer himself. However, as with all the letters, there was no conclusive evidence that the "From Hell" letter was genuine, and doubts about its authenticity persisted. Debates over the authenticity of the letters. The authenticity of the letters, including the "From Hell" letter, has been a subject of intense debate for over a century. At the time, the police were skeptical of the letters, especially those that seemed to revel in the killer's actions. Some investigators believed that the letters were hoaxes, sent by pranksters or attention seekers eager to capitalize on the growing media frenzy. The police even considered the possibility that some of the letters were written by journalists themselves in an attempt to increase public interest in the case. One major issue with the letters was the lack of forensic evidence linking them to the killer. While some of the letters contained graphic details about the murders, there was no physical evidence that definitively tied them to the Ripper. In the case of the "From Hell" letter, the small box containing the kidney fragment could have been planted by anyone, not necessarily the killer. Furthermore, the handwriting in the letters varied, with some experts arguing that the different styles suggested multiple authors, rather than a single, consistent writer. Over time, the debate over the letters has become more nuanced. Some modern experts believe that while some of the letters may have been written by hoaxers, others, especially the "from hell" letter, may have been genuine. Forensic analysis of the handwriting and the possibility of DNA testing on the letters have only added to the complexity of the case. However, despite advances in forensic technology, no definitive conclusions have been reached about the letters' authenticity. How the letters influenced the press and public perception. Regardless of whether the letters were genuine or not, their impact on the public perception of the case cannot be overstated. The letters, particularly the "Dear Boss" letter and the "From Hell" letter, were widely publicized and helped to solidify the image of Jack the Ripper as a cunning and taunting killer. The press eagerly seized upon the letters, printing them in full and sensationalizing every detail. This media frenzy turned Jack the Ripper from a faceless killer into a notorious figure, a symbol of terror who seemed to relish in the fear and confusion he was causing. The letters also had a profound effect on the way the public viewed the police and the investigation. The killer's mocking tone in the "Dear Boss" letter seemed to suggest that the police were incompetent and unable to catch him, a sentiment that resonated with many in the public. This feeling of helplessness and frustration only added to the sense of panic in Whitechapel and beyond. Moreover, the letters contributed to the creation of the Jack the Ripper myth. They reinforced the idea of the killer as an almost mythical figure, someone who was both terrifying and elusive, hiding in the shadows while taunting the authorities with his supposed intelligence and superiority. The killer's apparent enjoyment of his murders, as expressed in the letters, only added to his mystique and perpetuated the fear that he was always one step ahead of the police. The Ripper's letters also played a key role in the rise of the detective genre in literature. Authors like Arthur Conan Doyle, who would go on to create the legendary detective Sherlock Holmes, were deeply influenced by the public obsession with the Ripper case. The killer's letters, with their cryptic messages and challenges to the police, became a symbol of the detective's greatest challenge, solving a crime that was both gruesome and deliberately designed to confound the authorities. The mysterious letters sent by Jack the Ripper, particularly the "From Hell" letter, remain one of the most intriguing and chilling aspects of the case. Whether genuine or hoaxes, these letters played a significant role in shaping the public perception of the killer and contributed to the creation of the Ripper myth. They added an air of mystery and terror to an already terrifying situation and continue to captivate those who study the case today. The investigation and police mistakes. The failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case, particularly given the intensity of the investigation and the growing public pressure to solve the murders. Despite a large-scale effort by Scotland Yard and the involvement of various detectives, the killer was never apprehended, and the case remains unsolved to this day. There were numerous factors at play that contributed to this failure, including limitations in forensic science, key mistakes made during the investigation, and the overwhelming influence of public pressure and media sensationalism. Why did the police fail to catch Jack the Ripper? The failure of the police to apprehend Jack the Ripper, despite their best efforts, is often seen as a reflection of both the challenges faced by law enforcement at the time and the sheer audacity of the killer. Several key factors contributed to the inability of the police to solve the case, even though they were aware of the growing panic and the public's increasing demands for justice. Another significant challenge for the police was the vast number of suspects that arose during the investigation. Every time a new victim was found, a new wave of theories and potential suspects would emerge, further complicating the investigation. The killer's elusive nature only added to the mystery, as he seemed to vanish without a trace after each murder. The police struggled to keep up with the rapidly changing nature of the case, and many of their investigative efforts were wasted on false leads. The limitations of forensic science in the 19th century. One of the most significant reasons for the failure to apprehend Jack the Ripper was the lack of advanced forensic science available in the 1880s. While the field of criminology was beginning to develop, it was still in its early stages, and police detectives did not have access to the sophisticated tools and techniques that are available today. For example, fingerprinting, which has become one of the cornerstones of modern criminal investigations, was not yet in use. While the police did collect some physical evidence, such as bloodstains and clothing fragments, there was little they could do to analyze it effectively. Autopsy reports, although performed on the victims, were often lacking in detail. In many cases, the pathologists did not have the necessary expertise to fully understand the significance of certain findings, such as the precise nature of the mutilations or the medical implications of missing organs. In one case, for example, the removal of Catherine Eddowes' kidney was not immediately recognized as potentially important, as there was no scientific framework in place to connect such an act to a broader understanding of human behavior or pathology. The use of DNA as a tool for identifying criminals was still more than a century away, and the ability to link evidence across different crime scenes was non-existent. Without the ability to connect physical evidence to a suspect through modern forensic means, the police were left with little more than circumstantial evidence and witness statements, which often led to dead ends. The investigation was also hindered by the lack of a reliable database for tracking suspects, and many leads were discarded simply because they lacked the scientific backing that would have made them useful. Even basic ballistics, which could have been used to match weapons to crimes, were not available to the police. While the Ripper was using a knife in his killings, a more modern understanding of how weapons can be traced would have allowed for a better understanding of the pattern of attacks. Without these tools, police had to rely on old-fashioned detective work, which was often ineffective in a case as complex as the one presented by Jack the Ripper. Key suspects and missed opportunities. Over the course of the investigation, a number of suspects were proposed, but none of them were definitively linked to the murders. Some of these suspects were later dismissed, while others continue to be discussed by modern ripperologists. Among the most prominent suspects were Aaron Kosminski, a mentally ill Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel. Kosminski was a suspect from the early days of the investigation. He was known to have a history of violence and delusions, and witnesses reported that he had been seen near some of the crime scenes. Despite these connections, there was no conclusive evidence to link him to the murders, and he was eventually dismissed as a suspect. Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher who came from a well-to-do family. He was suggested as a suspect due to his mysterious death in December 1888, shortly after the final murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Some believe that his death indicated that he might have been the Ripper, but there was no evidence to support this theory, and Druitt's death was ruled a suicide, which raised further doubts. John Nedley, a coachman who had worked for a doctor in Whitechapel. Nedley was linked to the case due to his proximity to some of the crime scenes and the fact that he had access to medical instruments. However, like the other suspects, there was no solid evidence that connected him to the murders, and he was eventually cleared. Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American doctor with a questionable background, Tumblety was another early suspect. He had been arrested for unrelated crimes and was known to have been in London during the time of the murders. He was also rumored to have been fascinated with female anatomy and may have had a motive tied to his misogynistic views. Despite this, no evidence was found to directly connect him to the crimes, and he left London shortly after the murders stopped. Prince Albert Victor, one of the most sensational theories, though widely dismissed by serious researchers, suggested that Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, may have been the killer. This theory was based on conspiracy theories, rumors, and the idea that the royal family may have been trying to cover up the prince's involvement in the murders. However, there was no credible evidence to support this claim, and it remains a fringe theory. In addition to these suspects, numerous other theories have been put forward, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish. Some have suggested that the killer was an artist or a surgeon, while others have claimed that he may have been someone with a personal vendetta against women. Despite the variety of theories, the police were unable to focus on any one suspect for long enough to make a meaningful arrest. There were also numerous missed opportunities throughout the investigation, many of which were the result of the police's lack of experience and the chaotic nature of the case. For example, in some cases, witnesses who claimed to have seen the killer were unable to provide useful descriptions due to their fear, shock, or inebriation. At one point, The police even considered the possibility that the Ripper might have been someone who was operating within the medical community due to the surgical precision of the mutilations, but they were unable to confirm this theory. The impact of public pressure and media sensationalism. The public pressure on the police to catch Jack the Ripper was immense, and it played a significant role in the investigation's failure. As the murders continued, the public's fear grew, and the demand for answers became louder. Newspapers, eager to sell copies, sensationalized the case and put tremendous pressure on the police to solve the crime. This media frenzy created a situation in which the police had to balance their investigative work with the demands of the press and the public. The media's role in shaping the investigation cannot be understated. In many cases, newspapers would publish false leads or sensationalized details about the murders, which could distort the direction of the investigation. The press often portrayed the Ripper as a criminal mastermind, adding to the myth of his elusiveness and heightening public hysteria. The media's portrayal of the murders, combined with the growing panic in the streets of London, created an atmosphere in which the police were forced to react to public opinion rather than focusing on their own investigative strategy. In addition to this, the police were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the case. They had limited resources and personnel, and they were dealing with a community that was largely distrustful of law enforcement. The East End of London, where the murders took place, was a poor and overcrowded area, and many of its residents were reluctant to cooperate with the police. This made it difficult for the authorities to gain valuable intelligence from the community, further complicating the investigation. The police's response to public pressure and media sensationalism was one of the key factors that contributed to their failure to catch Jack the Ripper. While the authorities were doing their best to investigate the murders, they were often bogged down by the constant barrage of rumors, false leads, and sensationalized stories coming from the press. As the media continued to focus on the killer's brutality and the police's inability to catch him, the case became less about finding the killer and more about managing public perception. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper was a result of multiple factors, including the limitations of forensic science, key mistakes made during the investigation, missed opportunities, and the overwhelming impact of public pressure and media sensationalism. While the police made efforts to solve the case, they were ultimately unable to overcome the many obstacles they faced, and the killer's identity remains a mystery to this day. Suspects and theories. The identity of Jack the Ripper has been the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation for over a century. Hundreds of names have been suggested as potential suspects, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish. Some have been supported by circumstantial evidence, while others have been debunked by more recent research or forensic analysis. The enduring mystery surrounding the Ripper's identity can be partly attributed to the lack of conclusive evidence, the passage of time, and the ever-evolving nature of forensic techniques. In this section, we will explore some of the most prominent suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, as well as the role modern forensic evidence has played in reshaping the theories about the killer's identity. Aaron Kosminski, the mentally ill Polish immigrant. One of the most widely discussed suspects is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in the Whitechapel area. Kosminski has become a central figure in Ripper studies, particularly following a claim in 1999 that DNA evidence from a scarf found at one of the crime scenes linked him to the murders. Kosminski was known to have been mentally unstable, and several of his contemporaries described him as having a violent, unkempt demeanor. These characteristics, along with his apparent delusions and irrational behavior, led some to believe he might be the elusive killer. Background and evidence. Kosminski was born in Poland in 1865 and immigrated to London with his family in the early 1880s. By the time of the murders, he had settled in the Whitechapel district, which was notorious for its poverty, crime, and overcrowded living conditions. Kosminski worked as a barber, a trade he would continue to practice in the East End. His connection to the area and his occupation made him a potential candidate, given that the killer seemed to possess a degree of surgical skill, as evidenced by the precision of the mutilations. Kosminski was committed to an asylum for the mentally ill in 1891, 3 years after the murders ended. His apparent mental instability and violent outbursts led his family to seek medical help. Some sources suggest that Kosminski had a history of violence toward women, a pattern that matches the Ripper's behavior, but there is no direct evidence connecting him to the killings. What elevated Kosminski as a suspect in modern ripperology were later claims about DNA evidence. In 1999, a scarf allegedly belonging to one of the victims, Catherine Eddowes, was tested for DNA, and traces of blood and semen were purported to have been found. Some proponents of Kosminski's guilt point to this DNA evidence as proof that he was the killer. However, the authenticity of this evidence has been called into question. Critics argue that contamination of the scarf over the years, as well as the questionable chain of custody, undermines the credibility of these claims. Additionally, the fact that Kosminski was never formally implicated by the police, and there are no direct links between him and the crimes, makes the case for his involvement inconclusive at best. Montague John Druitt, the barrister and schoolteacher. Another prominent suspect is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who became a suspect largely because of the timing of his death. Druitt was a well-educated man from a respectable family, and his connection to the Ripper murders was initially suggested due to the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. Background and evidence. Druitt was born in 1857 to a family of means, and he was educated at Winchester College and later at the University of Oxford. He initially worked as a barrister and later became a schoolteacher. He was described by his peers as well-mannered and intelligent, although there were rumors about his personal life. His mother and siblings had a history of mental illness, and some theorists believe that Druitt's own mental state may have played a role in the murders. Druitt's name entered the list of Ripper suspects primarily due to the timing of his death. In December 1888, shortly after the last canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered, Druitt's body was found in the Thames River. His death was ruled a suicide, and some ripperologists have suggested that his suicide might have been the result of guilt over the murders. However, this theory remains speculative, as there is no direct evidence to link Druitt to the crimes. Druitt's candidacy as a suspect was largely based on circumstantial evidence, and he was never seriously considered by the police during the investigation. Some later theorists, however, argue that his status as an educated and respectable man could explain why he was able to elude capture for as long as he did. His death also occurred at a time when the murders stopped abruptly, fueling the idea that he might have been the Ripper. Despite these theories, there is no concrete evidence linking Druitt to the murders. His death remains suspicious, but the connection to the Ripper remains unproven. John Netley, the coachman and alleged accomplice. John Netley, a coachman who worked for a prominent surgeon named Dr. William Gull, is another suspect who has been proposed over the years. Netley was rumored to have had access to medical instruments and was said to have been frequently seen near the scenes of the murders. Some have suggested that he was either the Ripper himself or that he assisted Dr. Gull in the killings, though there is no direct evidence to support this theory. Background and evidence. Netley's name first appeared in connection with the Ripper case due to his relationship with Dr. William Gull, a well-known physician in London. Some conspiracy theories have suggested that Gull, who was rumored to be involved in high society circles, may have been responsible for the murders, with Netley acting as an accomplice. The theory posits that Dr. Gull may have had a personal motive for the killings, possibly connected to the royal family or other high-ranking individuals, and that Netley helped him cover up the crimes. The theory linking Netley to the Ripper is based more on circumstantial evidence and speculative connections than on concrete facts. While it is true that Netley had access to medical instruments and was seen in the vicinity of the crime scenes, there is no evidence that links him directly to the murders. Moreover, the theory that he was working alongside Dr. Gull has largely been dismissed by modern scholars, as there is no credible evidence to support such an elaborate conspiracy. Dr. Francis Tumblety, the eccentric doctor and fraudster. Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a dubious medical background, has long been a figure of interest in the Ripper case. Tumblety's eccentric behavior, combined with his misogynistic views and possible connections to the murders, have led some to speculate that he may have been the Ripper. Background and evidence. Tumblety was born in 1833 in Canada and later moved to the United States, where he worked as a self-proclaimed doctor. His medical credentials were dubious at best, and he was frequently accused of fraud and malpractice. Despite his lack of formal training, Tumblety managed to gain a reputation for treating various ailments, often using dubious or dangerous methods. Tumblety's name first appeared in connection with the Ripper murders when it was revealed that he had been in London during the time of the killings. He had been arrested in 1888 for unrelated charges and was later released, but he was rumored to have been seen near several of the crime scenes. Furthermore, Tumblety's misogynistic views and his alleged fascination with female anatomy made him a plausible suspect in the eyes of some investigators. Some even suggested that his medical background might have provided him with the skills necessary for the brutal mutilations. However, there is no direct evidence to link Tumblety to the murders, and he was never formally charged or implicated. His movements in London remain poorly documented, and the idea that he was the Ripper remains a theory rather than a fact. Prince Albert Victor, Royal Conspiracy Theories. One of the most sensational and enduring theories about the identity of Jack the Ripper involves Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria. According to some conspiracy theories, the prince may have been involved in the murders, possibly as part of a cover-up orchestrated by the royal family. Background and evidence. Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and was second in line to the British throne. In the years following the murders, rumors circulated that Eddie had been involved in the killings, either directly or indirectly. Theories ranged from claims that the prince had a secret marriage with a commoner, which led to a scandal, to the idea that he was mentally unstable and carried out the murders as a form of psychotic revenge. One of the most famous proponents of this theory was the journalist and author Stephen Knight, who published Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution in 1976. Knight claimed that the murders were part of a royal conspiracy to cover up the prince's secret marriage and protect the royal family from scandal. According to Knight, the murders were orchestrated by Dr. William Gull, who was acting on behalf of the royal family to eliminate witnesses and cover up the prince's involvement. Despite the sensational nature of these theories, there is no credible evidence to support the idea that Prince Albert Victor was the Ripper. The royal family was never implicated by the police, and most historians dismiss the theory as pure speculation. The connection between the prince and the murders remains one of the most enduring conspiracy theories in Ripper lore, but it lacks any solid foundation. Modern forensic evidence and DNA testing. In recent years, advances in forensic science, particularly DNA testing, have brought new hope to those seeking to identify Jack the Ripper. Some researchers have attempted to apply modern techniques to the old case, hoping to uncover new evidence that could reveal the true identity of the killer. However, the application of DNA testing to the case has been fraught with challenges. In 2001, a DNA sample was extracted from a scarf allegedly found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. The sample was tested and purported to show traces of blood and semen. Some proponents of the theory that Aaron Kosminski was the Ripper argued that this evidence linked him to the crime scene. However, critics have raised concerns about the chain of custody of the scarf, the possibility of contamination, and the accuracy of the DNA analysis. While DNA testing holds great potential, it remains a controversial and inconclusive method for solving the Ripper case. Why the identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. Despite over a century of research, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The lack of conclusive evidence, the passage of time, and the complexity of the case all contribute to the enduring uncertainty surrounding the killer's identity. While many suspects have been proposed, none of them have been definitively proven to be the Ripper. The failure to solve the case has only fueled the fascination with the murders and has kept the legend of Jack the Ripper alive in popular culture. Theories will continue to abound, but unless new evidence emerges, the true identity of Jack the Ripper may never be known. The killer's ability to evade capture, combined with the sensational nature of the crimes, has ensured that the mystery remains one of the most enduring and captivating stories in criminal history. Jack the Ripper in popular culture. The figure of Jack the Ripper has transcended the gruesome historical reality of the murders, evolving into a powerful cultural icon. This mysterious and terrifying killer has captivated the imagination of countless generations, leaving an indelible mark on literature, film, television, art, theater, and even video games. The mystery surrounding the identity of the killer, combined with the sheer brutality of the crimes, has ensured that the story of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most enduring myths in modern culture. His legacy continues to influence not only true crime stories but also the detective and horror genres, where he is often cited as the archetype of evil. In this section, we explore how the Ripper's legend has been portrayed and reimagined across various forms of media. The Ripper's influence on literature, films, and television. Jack the Ripper's impact on literature and cinema began almost immediately after the murders, and his story has been retold in countless ways. From early sensational newspaper reports to contemporary works of fiction, the Ripper's dark mythos has inspired generations of writers and filmmakers. Literature. The first works of fiction inspired by the Ripper were published just after the murders, at a time when the press was flooded with speculation and theories. These early accounts of the killings often portrayed the killer as a shadowy, monstrous figure. In the years that followed, several novels explored and expanded upon the Ripper's legend. One of the most influential early works was The Mystery of Jack the Ripper by Marie Belloc-Lowndes, published in 1911. This novel fictionalized the murders and presented a psychological portrait of the killer, emphasizing his disturbing and mysterious nature. This approach to the Ripper's character as a figure of horror and terror became a template for much of the literature that followed. In 1987, the novel The Ripper by Patricia Cornwell re-examined the case with a forensic approach. Cornwell's book, which proposed that the Ripper was the artist Walter Sickert, utilized modern forensic analysis and historical research to argue for a specific suspect. Cornwell's approach helped to renew interest in the case in the late 20th century, and it solidified Jack the Ripper's place in popular literature. The Ripper's story has also served as a significant influence on the horror genre, particularly in works that blend historical events with Gothic and supernatural elements. In The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Kevin O'Neill, Jack the Ripper appears as part of a larger narrative that blends famous literary characters. This version of the Ripper is a haunting reflection of Victorian fears, and the character's appearance further cements the killer's role as a symbol of darkness and evil in modern fiction. Film and television. In cinema, Jack the Ripper has been the subject of numerous films, each presenting a different take on the infamous killer. Early portrayals often took a melodramatic approach, with the Ripper being depicted as a shadowy figure lurking in the foggy streets of London. One of the earliest films to tackle the story was The Lodger, a story of the London fog, 1927, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Although not a direct adaptation of the Ripper story, it was heavily inspired by the murders and played a significant role in establishing the archetype of the mysterious, silent killer in the cinematic tradition. As horror films became more popular in the mid-20th century, Jack the Ripper's legend evolved, with some filmmakers adding supernatural or fantastical elements. Films like Hands of the Ripper, 1971, and A Study in Terror, 1965, combined the historical murders with fictionalized elements of horror and mystery, often depicting the Ripper as a figure driven by evil forces or a malevolent supernatural presence. Perhaps one of the most famous depictions of Jack the Ripper on film came in the 1979 movie Jack the Ripper, which portrayed the killer as a ruthless, intelligent man driven by dark urges. It is one of the many films to present the killer as a methodical and chilling figure, but the ambiguity of the Ripper's identity often serves as an unsettling aspect of these stories. Even more recent films, such as From Hell, 2001, based on Alan Moore's graphic novel, have used the Ripper as a vehicle for exploring conspiracies and larger societal fears. From Hell explores the theory that the murders were connected to the British royal family, adding a historical conspiracy element to the story that has become a significant part of popular Ripper mythology. On television, the Ripper has been a constant figure in both fictionalized accounts and more documentary-style series. Numerous television shows, including Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Story, 1993, and Ripper Street, 2012 to 2016, have dramatized the search for the killer, offering different interpretations of the case and the detective work involved. In the latter show, Ripper Street, the police investigation following the murders is explored in a historical crime drama format, giving viewers a sense of what it might have been like to work on the case with the same limited resources and knowledge available to detectives at the time. Jack the Ripper in art, theater, and video games. The Ripper's presence is not confined solely to the realm of written stories and visual media. His eerie legacy has also been felt in the world of art, theater, and even video games. Artists and playwrights have been captivated by the mystery surrounding the killings, using the figure of the Ripper as both an inspiration and a symbol. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jack the Ripper became a subject of fascination for many artists. The gruesome nature of the murders and the killer's anonymous identity captured the imagination of artists, particularly those within the symbolist and Gothic art movements. Paintings, sketches, and engravings based on the crimes often depicted the killer as a faceless figure, shrouded in shadow and mystery. One notable example of Ripper-inspired art is The Ripper, 1901, an oil painting by artist Louis Legrand. The work, which was exhibited at the Paris Salon, shows a haunting figure stalking a woman in the fog of Whitechapel. The figure of the killer is represented in a blurred and almost indistinguishable way, reinforcing the notion of the Ripper's elusiveness. In addition to paintings, the Ripper has been featured in more surreal and disturbing forms of art, where he often represents the darker aspects of human nature. The killer's anonymity and apparent lack of motive have led many artists to use him as a symbol of uncontrollable violence, chaos, and the unknown. Theater. Jack the Ripper's influence extends to the world of theater, where his story has been adapted for the stage in a variety of forms. The theatrical depiction of the Ripper often brings a sense of immediacy to the story, emphasizing the terror and paranoia of living in a city where a killer was at large, yet unknown. One of the most famous plays to engage with the Ripper legend is The Ripper, 1972, which was staged in London as a musical. This production used a mix of suspense and melodrama to recount the events of the murders, with a focus on the chilling atmosphere of Victorian London. Many other Ripper-related plays have followed, incorporating elements of horror, thriller, and drama to create an immersive experience for audiences. The evolution of his image in pop culture. The way Jack the Ripper has been portrayed in popular culture has changed significantly over time. Initially seen as a monstrous figure who embodied the dark fears of Victorian London, his image has evolved in response to changing cultural attitudes and the shifting demands of entertainment. In the early 20th century, the Ripper was often depicted as an almost supernatural figure, something otherworldly and implacable. This image was reinforced by the lack of any concrete suspect and the enduring mystery surrounding the crimes. As time passed, however, the Ripper began to take on a more humanized form, with portrayals focusing on his psychology and motivations. Modern portrayals of Jack the Ripper often explore his psychology and possible reasons for the murders. In works like From Hell, 2001, and Ripper Street, the Ripper is depicted not just as a figure of terror but as a deeply disturbed individual, perhaps even a product of his environment. This shift reflects a broader interest in understanding the motives behind violent crime and the complexities of human behavior. The impact on detective and horror genres. Jack the Ripper's influence is particularly evident in the detective and horror genres, where he has served as the archetype for countless fictional killers. The Ripper's case, unsolved and terrifying, has had a lasting impact on the development of detective fiction. His methods, his ability to evade capture, and the general sense of dread he invoked have influenced how many fictional detectives approach their cases. The Ripper's story has been cited as a key inspiration for later detective stories, especially those involving the hunt for a mysterious or elusive killer. The figure of the detective, working tirelessly to track down the criminal while grappling with the limitations of forensic science and societal prejudices, emerged in part as a response to the unsolved nature of the Ripper case. In many ways, the detective genre, particularly in its early years, can be seen as a reaction to the horrors and frustrations of the Jack the Ripper case. In the horror genre, Jack the Ripper's influence has been equally profound. As one of the first and most terrifying examples of real-life violence blending with the supernatural and mythical, the Ripper's image has inspired a multitude of horror stories, films, and works of art. His legacy lives on as a symbol of unspeakable terror, an idea that continues to haunt audiences, whether in the pages of a horror novel, the scenes of a slasher film, or the thrills of a psychological thriller. In conclusion, Jack the Ripper's continued presence in popular culture attests to his status as one of the most enduring and captivating figures in the history of crime. His influence spans across centuries of storytelling, from the earliest newspaper reports to the modern age of film, television, and digital media. As society's fascination with the Ripper grows, so too does his transformation into a timeless figure that represents both the horrors of the past and the mysteries that continue to capture the human imagination. Modern investigations and new discoveries. Jack the Ripper's case, despite remaining unsolved for over a century, continues to captivate modern investigators and enthusiasts alike. The mystery surrounding the identity of the killer has sparked an ongoing fascination that has not waned, even as the passage of time has dulled the immediate shock of the crimes. With the rise of new forensic techniques, the availability of more extensive historical records, and an increase in public interest, the investigation into the Ripper case has taken on new life in the modern era. In this section, we explore the advances in forensic science that have provided fresh avenues for understanding the murders, the emerging suspects and theories that have arisen in recent years, the key works and documentaries that have reignited public interest, and why the case continues to hold such fascination today. Advances in forensic science, DNA, profiling, and new leads. One of the most significant developments in modern Ripper investigations has been the rise of forensic science. Forensic methods, which were in their infancy during the Victorian era, have made incredible strides in recent decades, opening up new possibilities for solving cold cases. DNA analysis. DNA analysis is perhaps the most high-profile of these advancements. In recent years, DNA evidence has played a critical role in solving several long unsolved cases, and the Jack the Ripper case has not been exempt from this. Although DNA profiling wasn't available during the original investigations, modern methods have allowed researchers to revisit evidence from the time, searching for genetic material that might link a suspect to the crimes. One of the most famous attempts to use DNA in the Jack the Ripper case came in 2014 when researchers, led by criminal profiler Dr. Jari Louhelainen, analyzed a piece of evidence from the 1888 murders, a shawl found near the body of Catherine Eddowes. The shawl had reportedly been found by police officers shortly after the murder, though it was not immediately considered important at the time. The shawl was later preserved as evidence, but its forensic value remained uncertain. Dr. Louhelainen's team extracted mitochondrial DNA from the shawl and found traces of genetic material linked to both Catherine Eddowes and a potential suspect, Aaron Kosminski. This breakthrough, however, was not without controversy. The DNA analysis came under scrutiny for its accuracy, with critics arguing that the results were inconclusive. Some scientists questioned whether the DNA from the shawl could be contaminated or whether the link to Kosminski was a coincidence. While the study reignited interest in Kosminski as a suspect, it did not definitively close the case, and questions remain about the validity of the evidence. Despite this, the use of DNA analysis in this context marked a significant step forward in the ongoing efforts to solve the case. It demonstrated how modern forensic techniques could provide valuable insights into evidence that had remained dormant for over a century. As the technology continues to evolve, future investigations may uncover even more compelling evidence that could help solve the mystery. Forensic profiling. In addition to DNA analysis, forensic profiling has become an essential tool in understanding the behavior and motivations of serial killers. Profiling involves studying the crime scene, the nature of the murders, and the patterns exhibited by the killer in order to create a psychological and behavioral profile. When applied to Jack the Ripper, forensic profiling has provided some compelling insights into the potential nature of the killer. Over the years, experts have suggested that Jack the Ripper may have been a highly organized individual, possibly with medical or surgical knowledge, given the precision with which he carried out the mutilations of his victims. Some profiling experts have speculated that the killer had a deep understanding of anatomy, which allowed him to perform the dissection-like cuts that horrified the public. Others believe that the killer may have been someone with a strong sense of control and a need to assert power, based on the way he seemed to stage the crime scenes and leave victims in specific positions. Though no one has definitively identified the Ripper's psychological profile, forensic profiling continues to play an important role in re-examining the case. It helps shape the understanding of the killer's potential behavior and motivations, providing a framework through which modern investigators can consider new suspects and theories. Recent studies and emerging suspects. In addition to new forensic techniques, several new studies and investigations have brought fresh attention to the case. Over the last few decades, numerous individuals have been proposed as potential suspects, with various theories about who the killer might have been. While none of these theories have been conclusively proven, they have added depth to the investigation and sparked renewed interest in solving the case. Aaron Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel, has long been a leading suspect in the case. Kosminski was known to have a history of mental illness, and many experts have suggested that his unstable behavior and his proximity to the crimes make him a plausible candidate. DNA evidence, as previously mentioned, has also been linked to Kosminski, further fueling speculation that he may have been the killer. However, the lack of direct evidence tying him to the murders has kept him from being definitively identified as the Ripper. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher, has also emerged as a prominent suspect. Druitt's background as a well-educated professional was initially seen as a barrier to his involvement in the killings, but over time, theories have emerged suggesting that he may have had a history of mental instability. Some argue that Druitt's apparent suicide shortly after the final Ripper murder points to him as a likely suspect. His death, combined with the cessation of the killings, has led some researchers to believe that the murders ended because the killer died or was incapacitated. More recently, theories have emerged that suggest that Jack the Ripper may have been someone with a close connection to the medical or royal circles of Victorian London. One theory, first proposed in the 1990s, was that the killer was a physician named Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a history of criminal behavior. Tumblety had been arrested for gross indecency in London shortly before the murders began and was known for his animosity toward women. His links to the medical profession, along with his suspicious behavior, have made him a plausible candidate for some researchers. Another theory, which has been popularized in various books and documentaries, is that Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, was involved in the murders. Proponents of this theory claim that the prince was part of a royal conspiracy to cover up his involvement in the killings, possibly because of his illegitimate relationship with a woman named Annie Crook. While this theory remains speculative, it has captured the imagination of many due to the idea of a royal figure being involved in such a horrific crime. Several key books and documentaries have contributed to the ongoing public fascination with the Jack the Ripper case. These works offer different perspectives on the investigation, with some focusing on historical research, others on the psychological aspects of the killer, and still others on the various suspects. One of the most influential books on the case is The Complete History of Jack the Ripper, 1992, by Philip Sugden. This book provides a comprehensive account of the murders, the investigation, and the various theories about the killer's identity. Sugden's careful, balanced approach has made his work one of the most respected in ripperology. Another significant book is Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, 1976, by Stephen Knight, which introduced the controversial theory of a royal conspiracy involving Prince Albert Victor. Knight's book generated widespread interest in the idea of the royal family being connected to the murders, although his conclusions have been heavily criticized by historians. Documentaries have also played a key role in keeping the Ripper mystery alive. Films such as Jack the Ripper, The Case Reopened, 1991, and Ripper Street, 2012, have explored the case from different angles, with Ripper Street providing a fictionalized but insightful account of the investigation. Documentaries like Jack the Ripper, The Missing Evidence, 2014, have delved into new forensic investigations and explored modern advances in DNA analysis, keeping the public engaged with the case. The enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, the mystery of the killer's identity remains unsolved, creating an aura of intrigue that encourages constant speculation. As new theories and potential suspects emerge, the mystery only deepens, fueling further interest in the case. Secondly, the brutality and precision of the crimes themselves continue to captivate the public imagination. The gruesome nature of the murders, particularly the mutilation of the victims, is chilling and grotesque. The fact that the killer was never caught adds to the sense of unease and horror that surrounds the case. Finally, the case reflects broader themes about society, crime, and justice. The story of Jack the Ripper touches on issues of class inequality, misogyny, and the limitations of the police force and forensic science in the 19th century. As such, the case serves as a mirror to the social and cultural anxieties of the time, making it a rich subject for exploration and discussion. The mystery of Jack the Ripper remains as compelling today as it was in 1888. Modern forensic advances, fresh investigations, and ongoing public interest ensure that the case will continue to be studied and speculated upon for years to come. Whether or not the true identity of the killer is ever discovered, the legend of Jack the Ripper will continue to capture the imagination of future generations. After more than a century of investigation, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Throughout the years, countless theories and suspects have emerged, each attempting to explain the killer's motives, identity, and the circumstances surrounding the grisly murders that terrified Victorian London. Despite the passage of time, the case continues to hold a deep fascination for both historians and the general public. In this conclusion, we will reflect on the possible identity of the killer, the way the case changed criminology and forensic science, the reasons behind the enduring legend, and the open questions that keep the Ripper mystery alive to this day. Final thoughts: who could Jack the Ripper have been? The question of who Jack the Ripper truly was remains unanswered, and it is likely that we will never know for certain. The absence of clear evidence, compounded by the limitations of forensic technology during the late 19th century, means that the killer's identity is shrouded in uncertainty. Theories have ranged from plausible candidates such as Aaron Kosminski, Montague John Druitt, and Dr. Francis Tumblety, to more exotic conspiracies involving royal figures or even members of London's high society. Each of these suspects has been the subject of intense debate, with evidence both supporting and contradicting their potential involvement in the crimes. Kosminski's name has resurfaced in recent years due to DNA analysis on evidence linked to the case, though the authenticity of the results remains contested. His background as a mentally unstable immigrant with a history of violent behavior makes him a strong contender, but the lack of conclusive evidence leaves room for doubt. Similarly, Montague John Druitt's tragic death shortly after the last Ripper murder is intriguing but does not provide the necessary proof to confirm him as the killer. The possibility of Dr. Tumblety's involvement due to his eccentric behavior and hatred of women also remains a compelling theory, though no direct link between him and the murders has ever been found. Despite these possibilities, there is a persistent sense that the killer may never be definitively identified. This uncertainty is a part of what has contributed to the lasting allure of the case. With every new theory and every fresh piece of evidence, the mystery deepens, fueling ongoing speculation. As new technologies emerge and old evidence is re-examined, it is possible that new insights may eventually shed light on the true identity of Jack the Ripper, but for now, the killer remains an elusive figure, forever part of criminal folklore. How the case changed criminology and forensic science. Although the Ripper case remains unsolved, its impact on criminology and forensic science has been profound. The investigation highlighted the limitations of 19th-century police work and forensic methods, leading to significant developments in both fields. One of the most notable aspects of the case was the failure to catch the killer despite the extensive investigation. The police's inability to identify the murderer or secure a conviction illustrated the need for improvements in criminal detection and the use of new technologies. At the time, forensic science was still in its infancy. The police relied on traditional methods such as witness testimony, physical evidence, and the occasional autopsy, but many of the advanced techniques we take for granted today, such as DNA analysis and criminal profiling, had not yet been developed. The Ripper case showed the necessity of establishing more effective and systematic approaches to criminal investigations. In the years following the murders, law enforcement agencies worldwide began to adopt new forensic practices that would eventually lead to more successful investigations. The Jack the Ripper case also contributed to the emergence of criminal profiling. By examining the nature of the murders, the brutality of the killings, and the apparent escalation of violence, early profilers attempted to draw psychological and behavioral conclusions about the murderer. This was one of the earliest applications of psychological analysis in criminal investigations, and it laid the foundation for modern profiling techniques used by criminal investigators today. Additionally, the Ripper case was pivotal in the development of investigative techniques such as fingerprinting, photography, and the preservation of crime scenes. Though these technologies were not yet in use during the time of the murders, they were later incorporated into police procedures, revolutionizing the way law enforcement approached crime scene investigations. In this sense, while the Jack the Ripper case may have ended in failure for the police, it indirectly contributed to the evolution of criminal justice practices, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in forensic science and investigation. Why the legend continues to endure. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Jack the Ripper case is how the legend has continued to endure over the years. Despite the passage of time and the lack of definitive answers, the case remains a part of our cultural consciousness. There are several key reasons why the mystery of Jack the Ripper has captivated audiences for so long and why the legend persists. The gruesome nature of the crimes. At the heart of the enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper is the sheer horror of the murders themselves. The brutality with which the killer carried out the crimes, mutilating the victims' bodies and performing dissection-like cuts, shocked the Victorian public and continues to disturb modern audiences. The gruesome nature of the killings, particularly the involvement of the murderer in the ritualistic aspects of the crime scenes, has led to an ongoing fascination with the killer's motivations and methods. The fact that the murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun only adds to the mystery. While the police were unable to catch the killer, the case remains one of the most chilling in history precisely because of the way it was left unresolved. The horror of the crimes, coupled with the public fear and panic they provoked, continues to be a source of intrigue, drawing people to revisit the case time and time again. The mystery of the identity. The unresolved nature of the case itself is another key factor in the lasting appeal of the Jack the Ripper legend. The fact that no one knows the true identity of the killer has allowed the mystery to persist, leaving room for speculation and theories to flourish. Every new book, documentary, or piece of forensic evidence offers a new possibility, and with each iteration, the mystery deepens. The thrill of trying to solve the case, to finally uncover the truth, is part of what keeps the case so compelling. Jack the Ripper represents an ultimate puzzle, one that has not been solved, despite decades of investigation. Moreover, the idea that the killer was never caught lends an air of myth and legend to the story. Jack the Ripper becomes less of a historical figure and more of a symbolic representation of fear, violence, and the unknown. As a result, the killer's identity has been enveloped in a cloud of speculation, which has turned the case into an enduring cultural enigma. The possibility of discovering the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains tantalizing, which is why the case continues to capture the imagination. The intersection of crime and society. Another reason for the case's enduring popularity is its connection to larger social issues in Victorian London. The Whitechapel district, where the murders took place, was a place of poverty, inequality, and social unrest. The victims were all women, many of whom were prostitutes, and the crimes served to highlight the grim realities of life in one of the poorest areas of London. Jack the Ripper's actions were seen as a reflection of the broader social anxieties of the time, from the dangers facing women in the streets to the growing concerns over the rise of criminality in urban centers. As the case continued to be analyzed and debated, it came to symbolize the tension between order and chaos, between the veneer of civilization and the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Jack the Ripper became an emblem of the unseen, the unaccountable evil that could strike at any moment and remain hidden in plain sight. Open questions and audience engagement. Despite the efforts of countless investigators, both professional and amateur, the question of Jack the Ripper's identity remains open. As modern forensic techniques continue to evolve, there is always the possibility that new breakthroughs will bring us closer to solving the mystery. The fact that the case remains open means that anyone can participate in the investigation, whether through the study of old records, the analysis of new evidence, or the generation of fresh theories. The enduring nature of the Jack the Ripper legend also invites audience engagement. The mystery has sparked a whole subculture of enthusiasts known as Ripperologists, individuals who devote themselves to researching every aspect of the case. These enthusiasts often gather at conferences, share findings in online forums, and create their own theories about who the killer may have been. The case's open-endedness invites speculation and participation, ensuring that it remains a focal point for crime aficionados and casual observers alike. In conclusion, the story of Jack the Ripper is one that continues to captivate the public's imagination, not only because of the brutality of the murders themselves but also because of the unsolved nature of the case. The killer's identity may never be fully known, but the case has forever changed how we think about crime, forensic science, and criminal investigation. Its place in popular culture, criminology, and history ensures that the legend of Jack the Ripper will continue to endure for generations to come. And while the mystery may remain unsolved, the search for answers will persist, continuing to intrigue and captivate future generations.